Take two. This is a paper I was actually I was gonna read last night on Arts panel, and this is in reference to a video I've done on basically the same thing from 2018, talking about the marriage and divorce patterns of Black women. I did that one that kind of caused a stir, and people were saying that this is an anomaly and that these patterns are recent. I had one guy that said these patterns only go back to the disco era. Really, the disco era. But, this paper is from 2018. Now, this paper is from 1998, excuse me. And it's called The African American Marriage Patterns. You can see the authors there, Besharov and Andrew West. It actually talks about the Kerner Commission, really. Let's see, in 1968, the Kerner Commission declared that the United States was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Happily, many of these commission's most distressing predictions have not come true, because of redress of grievances, affirmative action, and things like that. But with respect to marriage and child rearing, Black and white Americans do live in substantially different worlds, something I've said for quite a while. Over the past 50 years, for all Americans, marriage rates have declined while divorce rates and out-of-wedlock birth rates have climbed. But the negative changes have been greatest among African Americans. The decline of marriage compared with white women, African American women are 25% less likely to have ever married, and about half as likely to be currently married. According to the Census Bureau's Current Population Survey, CPS, in 1998, about 29% of African American women aged 15 and over were married with a spouse. 29% back then is 25 now. So basically, 20 years, you drop 4%, compared with about 55% of white women and 49% of Hispanic women. Let's start reading highlights. African American women are estimated to spend only half as long as white women married, 22 versus 44% of their lives. In the 1950s, after at least 70 years of rough parity, that means basically the same for the most part, African American marriage rates began to fall behind white rates. In 1950, the percentages of white and African American women aged 15 and over who were currently married were roughly the same, 67% and 64% respectively. By 1998, the percentage of currently married white women had dropped by 13% to 58%, but the drop among African American women was 44%, 36%, more than 3 times larger. The decline for males were roughly parallel, 12% for white men and 36% for African American men. In other words, the drop in marriage was roughly parallel, even though African American men are still more married than African American women by, I think, like 4 or 5%. But the percentage of never married African American women about doubled from 21% to 41%. Okay, even more significant has been a sharp divergence in never married rates between 1950 and 1998. The percentage of never married white women aged 15 and over rose from 20% to 22%, a 10% rise, but the percentage of never married African American women about double from 21% to 41%. For Hispanics, the data only began in 1970. Later marriage among African Americans accounts for only some of the difference. For example, between 1950 and 1998, the percentage of never married white women aged 40 and over actually fell from 9% to 5%, a 44% drop. But the percentage of never married African American women aged 40 and over rose by 200%, from 5% to 15%. In other words, that's crazy because it was reversed. African American women were actually more married than white women, especially after age 40. Thus, even adjusting for age, marriage rates declined after 1970 for whites, and in 1960 for African Americans. Basically, the white folks' marriage declined after the marriage laws changed, after the the no-fault divorce. That caused a decline in 1970 for whites, but 1961 with welfare is why the marriage rates for African Americans declined. So, but they didn't put that in there. At the same time that African American women are half as likely to marry as whites, they are more than twice as likely to divorce. See? Remember I was telling you that? In 2018, people said that it said the same thing, but they thought this was an anomaly. This is very common. This is very common. It started in 1960. You can see the rough parity in 1890. It's fairly close, and then you see the big divergence. Started to see the big divergence in 1960. Look at it, you can actually see it. You can see that big divergence in 1960. For example, in 1890, the first year for which national census data are available, the number of divorced women per 1,000 married women was 45% higher for African American women than for whites, 9-6. In other words, African American women have always had a higher divorce rate. That's what they're trying to say. So these are relatively small numbers, but they suggest that even when families were on the whole much stronger than they are today, African American women were still much likely to face marital disruption. These early divorce figures may not be completely accurate, however. Not only was divorce highly stigmatized before the 1960s, making it likely that divorces were underreported in early census years, but also E. Franklin Frazier pointed out 60 years ago, divorces among rural African Americans were more likely an informal agreement between two married people or two people living together, or the de facto result of long-standing separations. That's called a walking divorce. Called a walking divorce. I know several buddies that had walking divorces, where they were, one buddy, my best friend was actually married 3 times but only divorced once, okay? He never got divorced from his first wife. They just separated, and after a while he just got married to another person without getting divorced. It was very common. Regardless of the reliability of early census data, however, the racial difference in divorce is now quite large. By 1998, the African American divorce rate was more than twice as high as the white, 422 per 1,000 compared to 190 per 1,000. That's quite high. The divorce rate for Hispanic women doubled between 1970, the first year for which data are available, and 1998, 81 to 171,000, compared to the quadrupling of African American rate and the tripling of the white rate over the same period. Separation is about 4 times more common among African Americans than whites, and about 1.5 times more common than Hispanics. In 1998, according to the CPS data, over 20% of married black women aged 15 and over had an absent spouse, compared with 5% of married women and 13% of married Hispanic women the same age. So in other words, basically, even when you're not divorced, separation is still high. That's how come a lot of the African American women are the most unpartnered group in America. And the thing is, they always blame that on the men. An African American child is 3 times more likely to be born out of wedlock than a white child on average. Will spend only 6 years in a 2-parent family, compared with 14 years for a white child and 13 years for an Hispanic child. Called single mother homes, anybody? The proportion of births to unwed mothers has risen steadily since 1950. So now, almost 1/3 of all American children are born out of wedlock. From 1950 to 1997, the proportion of births to unmarried white women, non-Hispanic, increased almost 12-fold, from 2% to 22%. The African American portion increased 4-fold, from 18% to a striking 89%. In other words, in the 1950s, the unwed mother out of wedlock birth rate was 18%. In 98, it was 69%. And by the 2000s, in mid 2000s, it was 73%. A major factor driving these rates has been the decline in birth rates for married couples. Rather than a birth rate outside of marriage. In 1987, the birth rate for married black women actually fell below the birth rate for unmarried black women for the first time that has ever happened for any ethnic group. Words, basically, in William Julius Wilson said the same thing. I do believe in truly disadvantaged. It used to be black women in marriage had a fertility rate about, I think it was like 4 or 5, right? And when it dropped to 2, which is almost the same as the unwed mothers, that's how come the out of wedlock rate actually shot up. The percentage of babies born out of wedlock shot up, because if you're not getting married and the women that are married are not having the same amount of children, because you don't need them, that's what's going to happen to the birth rate, to the out of wedlock birth rate. It's going to shoot up. So there's a twofold problem. Similarly, the fertility rate of married African American women fell from 137.3 per thousand in 1950 to, see, it cut in half. Look at that. To 70.7. Had their fertility remained the same, the percentage of African American children born out of wedlock in 1997 would have been about 36% and not 69%. Also got to remember there was more married women. But the thing is, even though there was a higher marriage rate, married women had more children. When married women had half their children, guess what happened? Then the out of wedlock birth rate, the unwed birth rate, actually had more prominence. Having a baby out of wedlock is difficult enough. Having a baby as an unwed teenager is even more difficult. 1 in 5 American babies born to a teenage mother, but about twice the rate and 1.5 times the Hispanic rate. See what else we got here. We're not going to make this too long. I said almost all births to black teens are now out of wedlock. The overall births to teenagers were falling. The proportion of out of wedlock teenage births continue to rise because teens just don't marry very much anymore, but are still having babies. That's the problem that I was talking about with Concrete Rose and Sister George, right? They're saying you shouldn't get married till after 25, and sometimes after 30. Black women are actually getting married. I think the average age for them to have their first child is 23. I think it's 23. The median age to having the first child for a black woman is 23. But the median rate, or the average rate for them to get married, their first marriage, is 31. So they're having babies. They're having 1 or 2 babies, but they're not getting married. And the idea in the black community, especially now in the modern feminist community, is that they're too young to get married, but they're not too young to have babies. Make that make sense. A balanced perspective. At least since the appearance of Daniel Patrick Moynihan controversial 1965 report, you notice how they refer back to this stuff. People think that they don't go back to these reports. These reports are actually way more important than you think. They were never debunked. The plight of the black family has been the focus of much anxiety and debate. On the one side have been those who think that the black family is a tangle of pathology. Use Moynihan's phrase. Actually, it's Clark's phrase, but we won't quibble. On the other side have been those who see the black family as strong and vibrant, emphasizing its adaptability, to use Belinda Tucker's phrase, the strength of black families. The disagreement about the state of the black family is partly the result of misunderstanding. The first side tends to use family breakdown primarily to mean non-marriage, divorce, and non-marital childbearing. The other side tends to use the term family more broadly to include kin networks of parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and so forth that often help support single mothers and their children, and sometimes take them into their own homes and attempt to bridge this disagreement. This paper seeks to make a clear distinction between the breakdown, marriage was caused marital breakdown, and the role of the extended family structures, which in all communities is more important when marriages are weaker. This is something that they call the Africana Kinship Network, okay? And this actually worked down south when families broke up, that you had the close network of kin that could actually, bridge the gap or ameliorate some of these negative behaviors when families break up. But when you move to the urban environment, guess what happened? The kinship network is no more. That is the problem that Moynihan saw. That's the problem that Clark saw. And that's the problem that the Kerner Commission saw. When they were down south, they had adapted to their environment. They had adapted to men leaving and them being replaced by other men, but also large clan of people. But it also encourages what? Black women not staying with their men. So the father in the house is not as important. That's how come they call the black community a matriarchy. This is how matriarchy works. Without doubt, today's unexpectedly high rates of divorce and non-marital childbearing across all American society, and indeed most other Western nations, should be a matter of grave concern. Marital breakdown harms many of the adults and children involved because of its disproportionate impact on African Americans. Is a particular tragedy in that community. Public discourse, however, often goes too far in blaming marital breakdown for all the poverty and social dysfunction that afflict the black community. That is an equal terrible mistake, because marital breakdown, poverty, and social dysfunction interact. They are simultaneously both causes and effects of each other. In other words, and this is something that Dr. Gigi's going over in Dark Ghettos by Tommy Shelby, that it's not one or the other, where poverty and dysfunction causes family breakdown. But family breakdown also has a factor of causing the same thing. So behavior causes the environment to change, and the environment also has an impact on behavior. At first glance, marital breakdown has devastating effects on children, and to African American children in particular, because so many are born to unwed teenagers. Children born out of wedlock fall substantially below children from intact families on many important measures. In 1995, report to Congress from the Department of Health and Human Services summarizes: unmarried mothers are less likely to obtain prenatal care, more likely to have a low birth weight baby. Young children in single mother families tend to have lower scores on verbal and math achievement tests. In middle childhood, children raised by a single parent tend to receive lower grades, have more behavioral problems, have higher rates of chronic health and psychiatric disorders. Adolescents and young adults being raised in single mother family is associated with elevated risk of teenage childbearing, high school dropout, incarceration, and with being neither employed nor in school. National Longitudinal Survey of Youth shows that children born out of wedlock to never married mothers spend 51% of their childhood in poverty, compared to only 7% of children born to two-parent married families. Such children spend 71% of their childhood receiving some form of welfare, compared with 12% for children born to two-parent married families. That's true. That's what Moynihan was saying. The children of teenage parents, especially if unmarried, have more serious problems. For example, children of young teen mothers almost 3 times as likely to be behind bars at some point in their adolescence or early 20s are the children of mothers who delayed childbearing. That is pretty standard. What can be done about African Americans? Are there more than 3 centuries living on this continent that has made them so vulnerable to forces that weaken families? A number of factors seem to be at work. The devastating effects of slavery and Jim Crow laws on black marriages. I've said that, people still disagree with that. It keeps coming back. All the scholarly work. And these are not black people writing this. So white people writing this. And Jim Crow laws on black marriages, endemic poverty, which puts added stress on already weak families, even fewer gains from marriage, especially for women. Too early sex puts young girls at greater risk of unwanted pregnancy, and racial concentration that magnifies the impact of these conditions. This same set of explanations with a few modifications helps explain what is happening to Hispanic marriages, which are often included only as an afterthought in discussions about the family. In Hispanics are almost the same rates now that blacks are. Although separate data on Hispanic span only lasts 30 years, we do have enough information to make some preliminary conclusions. On most indicators, Hispanic marriages lie somewhere between those of whites and African Americans. This suggests that some of the same factors that affect African Americans, such as endemic poverty, too early sex, and residential concentration, also affect Hispanics. At the same time, the different cultural and historical background of Hispanics appears to ameliorate some of the forces that contribute to further marital weakness among African Americans. Other culture, the cultural and historical background that Hispanics have of not being enslaved and not being under Jim Crow tends to balance out the negative effects of poverty and the other factors. All right, that is the end of that. I think I've spoken way too long. So, but this kind of confirms the same things that the other paper is saying, that this is endemic. This is endemic to the African American culture. Slavery and Jim Crow has a huge factor on family formation and our family patterns. And people keep denying it. But like this paper shows, this didn't just start in the 1970s. This didn't just start in the 1980s. It started in the 1950s. In fact, this is well before some of this data was even collected. Just like Fraser said, you had walk-in divorces well before you had paper divorces. And amongst African Americans, even in the 1960s and 70s, you had way more walk-in divorces than you had paper divorces, official divorces. That's come the separation for African American is 4 times higher than the whites. So even when you factor in the unmarried rate of African American women, if you put in the separation rate, okay, the married rate actually probably goes down to like 20%, because you have a lot of black people that haven't filed the paperwork. Start filing the paperwork on separated or walk-in divorces amongst black people. The married rate of African American women will plunge down below 20, in my opinion. At some point, we're going to have to face this or figure out something else. Okay, it's obvious that black women don't like to be married. It's obvious they don't like to spend time with their husband. They don't want to be under a man. That's obvious. How can you be the least married and the most divorced? And even when you are married, you're still the most separated. Doesn't make sense, does it? But with that, I'm going to close it out here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.